Welcome to the Igniting Change podcast. My name is Duncan Cook, founder of Three-Sided Cube, trusted technology partner for some world-changing organizations. We know the power that technology has to have a positive impact on people's lives. But on this podcast, myself and my co-hosts Puff and Sophie are out to meet the people behind the technology, hear their stories and understand what drives them, and hopefully inspire others to join the mission and do some good in the world.
Hi everyone, I am joined today by Michael Kleinman. He is the Senior Director of Technology and Human Rights at Amnesty International USA, and he is a sucker for punishment because he's coming back for a second time with us on our podcast at Igniting Change. So hi Michael, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me again.
Thank you so much for joining us again. So obviously you spoke to my colleagues last time, so I get the joy of hearing all about you this time instead. So you are currently, or you have been at Amnesty for quite a while now. You were with them, Amnesty USA. You were with them when you came and spoke to us. That was December 2022. Having done a bit of a stalk on your LinkedIn, you have a very impressive background, very impressive bragging rights. Can you give us a bit of a recap of what you do and kind of how you got there, just for those who perhaps didn't catch you on the first podcast?
So, as you said, and first of all, thanks so much again for having me. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed the conversation last time and looking forward to the conversation this time. And my job at Amnesty is really threefold. So, first of all, I lead a team at Amnesty USA, which is the US branch of Amnesty International, looking at issues around tech and human rights. And the issues that my team is focused on are primarily around the intersection of tech and inequality. So what are the various ways that technologies, whether it's social media or surveillance, different kinds of algorithmic systems, can amplify and exacerbate existing social inequities. And my team also looks at issues around tech and reproductive rights, and in particular, ways in which large social media platforms tend to censor and suppress reproductive rights content online. Second, I serve as the main point of contact between the global amnesty movement and large tech companies in Silicon Valley in the US. So Meta, Google, Meta being Facebook,
Yeah,
Google,
had to do that.
Microsoft, and others, Twitter to a much lesser extent over the last 2 years.
Okay.
And when we engage with tech companies, we're really engaging on two different kinds of issues. The first is big policy issues. So what do we think and what do we insist that tech companies need to do differently in order to be rights respecting? So when you think about Facebook and you think about threats to your privacy, all the information that Facebook gathers, when you think about Twitter and you think about hate speech and abusive speech, these are all human rights issues. And so part of our engagement with tech companies is pushing them to do better to protect rights like the right to privacy, and coming up with really specific suggestions and advocacy campaigns to try and move them in that direction. And then the second way that we engage with tech companies is, Amnesty supports activists and human rights defenders worldwide who rely on these platforms, because as problematic as these platforms are, and they are deeply, deeply problematic, they also provide a platform and a megaphone for people who otherwise wouldn't be able to get their voices out there. And so when activists and human rights defenders and others that we support that are doing critical work in countries around the world, when they find that their accounts are suspended or taken down, or when they're facing harassment, we also can engage with tech companies on their behalf. And then the third aspect of my job, and the one that is, I think, particularly relevant to the conversation we're about to have, is helping the organization as a whole think through what are the human rights implications of new and emerging technology. And today when we talk about new and emerging technology, really the zeitgeist, we're talking about artificial intelligence and generative AI. And that current conversation around artificial intelligence is sort of, if you think about it, in some way shaped like a barbell. So
Okay.
on the one side of that barbell, you have a lot of people talking about the current harms and opportunities of these tools. And when I say these tools, I mean things like ChatGPT, Dolly, Midjourney, what have you. And a lot of that conversation is around mis and disinformation, the way that these tools can be used to create content that is deeply problematic and spread it really rapidly. I have what I think is like a 6-week cough, which is slowly driving me crazy. So if I suddenly go like this, like the it's
That's that's fine.
um,
We can edit that in post. That's fine. You're not
mm,
doing anything. I'm just grabbing a pen. Sorry. Your camera's frozen, by the way. So this is the people are going to be devastated. But this is going to have to be a voice only. You have a
my
voice in a
camera's.
podcast, but
Oh
you're.
no, it's my camera because my camera's not frozen on my end.
Oh, good. Am I frozen on your end?
No, you're
Oh,
coming
okay.
through loud and
Oh,
clear.
look at this. You are
Um,
currently frozen, I'm afraid, but
am I frozen
we will
today?
work with it. But if I'm not responding to your facial things, that's why. It's not because I'm a Mark Zuckerberg robot. It's just because you're currently frozen. But
Is
we
this, first of all, am I frozen in like a particularly awkward, like mouth open?
not mouth open. You look very pleased to be here. So,
Oh, good. Self-satisfied. That's really what I was shooting for.
yeah. Sort of not
Yeah.
smug, but
Mm.
confident.
Um,
Sorry, that was a
as,
horrible
as, as
tangent.
we discussed, like a face for podcasting.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
So so part of so when we think about that discussion around new and emerging technologies, like one end of that barbell is actual harms that we're seeing today.
Mm-hmm.
The other end of that barbell is existential risk, and that's the whole conversation. Like, will these new powerful artificial intelligence tools pose some sort of cataclysmic threat
Yeah.
to mankind, to humankind, to our civilization? But what is missing, I think, is the middle of that barbell, where it gets real skinny.
Mm-hmm.
And that is between the harms that we see today and the however likely or unlikely, my thinking is more unlikely than not, risk of, some cataclysmic apocalypse. What are the medium term risks and opportunities? If we assume that this set of technologies is going to be transformative, then I think that we can safely assume that both the risks and the opportunities that we're going to face over the next 3 to 5 years are going to be different, not just in degree, but also in kind, from the kinds of risks and opportunities that we think about today when we think about tech. And so the third part of my job is trying to think through what some of those medium term risks and opportunities are, and then engaging with civil society and with the companies that are developing this technology to try and push them to do more when it comes to incorporating some of the thinking around potential risk and how to mitigate it.
Amazing. That was a very strong 3-part answer. I really enjoyed that. I guess the risk with the medium term when you're talking about the barbell, which I've had to draw because I had to remember what a barbell was because it's been that long since I've been to the gym. But that midterm, there's a lot of danger there, right? If everyone's kind of talking about the current and then the sort of totally overblown, potentially, robots are going to take over and steal our jobs and cancel human nature. All the time people are talking about that, they're not talking about the very real midterm things that actually will probably affect more people, and it won't be as dramatic as a robot takeover, but it will have serious effects on kind of human rights. So I guess that is excellent that you are focusing on those kind of midterm things, the risks and opportunities. It's nice to hear opportunities as well as risks, because I think a lot of the time when we talk about emerging tech, there's always that kind of tendency to go negative, and we will end on some of the positive, but it's good to work that in early. That's great. Okay, thank you so much for that. And you've been at Amnesty for a few years now, but prior to that, you've always worked in third sector in sort of good areas. That's lovely. Is that something? I think you mentioned it in the last one, and I very much enjoyed your explanation. But again, for the benefit of those who didn't hear it, can you tell us a bit about why kind of the third sector appeals to you?
I wish that I had like a really coherent answer. And I wish that answer was that I am deeply motivated by a sense of mission. But that fact is not the case. Like, I care, I want to do well
Sure.
and do good in the world. But the through line to my career, to the extent that there has been a through line, and I started as a humanitarian and development aid worker in Afghanistan and then East and Central Africa and then Iraq, and then worked at a foundation funding peace building initiatives in East and West Africa. And then I started a company that helped the UN run large scale mobile phone surveys in conflict affected countries to try and get better feedback from affected communities, and then went to Amnesty and transitioned into the tech work. The through line, more than anything else, is a curiosity about what I see as some of the main and major issues of our time. And third sector work gives you the advantage of being able to think that you are hopefully doing more harm than good, but also gives you the opportunity to work on a really fascinating range of issues that seem incredibly pressing, whether it's about the ways in which our countries engage effectively or horrifically ineffectively overseas, and the impact that that has, all the way through to today, looking at some of the longer term impacts of technology.
Yeah, that's incredible. And that intersection between sort of the human rights and the technology, I guess, kind of more prevalent than ever in the last few years, obviously, where everything's kind of picked up and evolved as quickly as it has. You talked last time about some big wins that you'd had as a team. So in terms of the research that your team's doing, and you talked about the Pegasus example last time, which I got into a big rabbit hole looking into. So we will link the other episode in the notes. And that just sounded like absolutely incredible. And I know you said you couldn't possibly take any credit for that, which is always
No, certainly could not any credit whatsoever. I had nothing to do with it.
Always a sign of a good manager. But yeah, I mean, that looks, well, everything I read about it was just absolutely fascinating, and that kind of uncovering things like that must be, even though you can't take any credit for it, must be incredibly rewarding, and knowing that you're doing that work must be amazing for you and obviously for your team who are doing the bulk of the work. Can you tell us any sort of big wins that you've had since then? Obviously, it's not even 18 months ago, but kind of in our world, that is almost a lifetime.
What I think one of the things that Amnesty does, and does incredibly well, is actually quantify this. And so what our research does is take, the lived and anecdotal experience that we have, whether we're looking at abusive content, whether we see abusive content on social media, or we read about, the experiences of children and young people using TikTok, and quantifies it and shows not only the scale of what's happening, but ties it back to specific decisions that companies have made. And our research shows that these are not oh my God, who knew that this was going to happen? But a lot of the deeply disturbing and rights violating implications of technology are the result of specific choices. So I think that's some of the really impressive work that we've done over the last 18 months. And then in terms of my team, really, really, just to choose one thing, I think the work on the suppression of reproductive rights content online in the United States, and again, helping to quantify the ways in which platforms like Facebook are taking down content around medication abortion pills,
Right.
and making it incredibly difficult for people who need to access this information to get access to this information. I think that's an area where we're seeing slow progress, but progress nonetheless.
Okay, amazing. I have many notes. Yeah, that's all incredible stuff. I can imagine the research on the recommendation around the algorithm stuff is absolutely horrific, because like you say, people have made those choices. They're not like, oh, oops, we didn't realize that this was going to happen. It's
No.
oh no, gosh, we made a mistake. They've made a conscious decision of, we know that, and I'm sure they're doing it for the revenue primarily, but knowing that that's going to be a result of that. I saw in one of the articles that you shared or written recently around the Meta's role in the Myanmar conflict, think it was 2017. And just that, the response that they gave of like, yeah, we're trying not to let people say bad stuff, but it's kind of, we're trying really hard. It's not good enough at all. So I think it's really amazing the work that Amnesty is doing to try and hold them accountable to it. But I can imagine that is pretty horrendous and probably has a pretty big impact on how people at Amnesty, and yourself included, must feel about kind of social media and wanting to give it a fairly wide berth. And the quantifying the data around the TikTok piece as well is just so interesting, because like you say, everyone kind of anecdotally is like, oh yeah, TikTok, like horrendous, it's the worst, and the rest of it. But I can imagine when you see numbers to it and those decisions that are made, that must be pretty damning. I don't know if you had any. I mean, you don't have to give your personal thoughts on social media, but I can imagine they're not overly friendly with the work that you've done.
I think it's complicated. I think all these things are complicated. I think that we have to walk a fine line, I think. And I think in some ways it's too easy to simply vilify social media platforms.
Yeah.
Not least because these are things that we all choose to use all the time. And there are people who are doing their best, within and outside these companies to address this.
Yeah.
I think that there's this temptation, this will become relevant when we talk about, AI, artificial intelligence and generative AI. There's this temptation, whether we're talking about tech or I think really anything else, to take what are fundamentally incredibly complicated systems and simplify them into sort of Manichaean narratives of good versus evil, in which we who are speaking are always on the side of good. And I think that there is psychologically a lot to be said for that. But I think that the risk when we're talking about any issue, period, and also when we talk about tech, is in our rush to sort of make it a morality play, we lose a tremendous amount of nuance. And I think losing that nuance makes us less effective as advocates, makes us less informed as users of these platforms. And I mean, my gun to my head, like, if you asked me, what does it mean to be an adult? I would have two answers. Like, one thing that it means to be an adult is you're willing to take responsibility, which is hard. Sometimes we do it, sometimes we don't. But the second thing that it means to be an adult is the ability to hold two ideas in your head at once and to not shy away from a certain level of complexity and gray. And that really, when we talk about the generative AI side of it, what draws me to that question of, as you said, not just medium-term risks, but opportunities, is that it is not only a field that is evolving really rapidly and might have tremendous impact on our lives, but it's all gray. It's all about trade-offs. And there is no perfect answer. Like, we can never have our cake and eat it too. We can never design a technology which does exactly what we want it to do without any negative consequences, for two reasons. First of all, what we, and here I mean we as individuals, want it to do might not be what someone else wants it to do. Your perfect use case could be very different from someone else's. And second, there's no aspect of life in which our actions are purely, only lead to intended positive consequences. And if there's anything I want people to take away from this conversation, it's that everything is trade-offs, especially when we're talking about like these questions of how do we try and make sure that tech is more rights respecting than not. there are conscious decisions that we can make, that companies should make, that would move us in that direction. But there's no like easy win. If there was, we would already have discovered it.
I mean, you say there's no perfect answer, Michael. That was pretty spot on. I would say that's a pretty near perfect answer to that question. I think you're absolutely right. Completely agree with you. The nuance is the thing, I guess. It's very easy to get caught up, as I often do, in the social media thing where you get caught in that trap. But again, it's simplifying it, like you say. So kind of similar to what we talked about at the beginning of, if you're kind of focusing too much on the extremes, you're kind of ignoring the middle ground, which is the, where there could be more damage, but also where there could be opportunity for it to do good. I mean, social media has undoubtedly done some good in its time. We can't completely take away from it. And I guess it is how you use it. And I think that's the thing that I struggle with personally, is the thing of like, we both work in the tech industry. So that level of understanding, when we're looking at things, we can be thinking, okay, what do they want me to take from this? Who benefits from showing me this on my algorithm, like on my feed, whatever? What, by showing me this, what does that do? That keeps me engaged. That makes me angry, so that I'm staying on it longer, and they're going to show me more ads. Whatever it is, we're kind of more informed. I guess the frustration that I have personally is around the sort of kids and people who aren't necessarily in the sector, who don't have that kind of understanding. They don't necessarily understand the nuance of it, kids in particular. So they're just going to kind of see it. I watch my 8-year-old watch things and he gets fed all sorts of stuff on YouTube.
I also have an 8-year-old.
Sorry?
I also have an 8-year-old.
Oh, we can compare notes on what they are watching on YouTube.
It is my favorite age.
It is
such a good age.
Such a good age, isn't it? I do absolutely love it. He's good fun. Have you got a boy or a girl? We can edit all this out afterwards. I mean, this is fine.
Oh, I mean, I assume that your listeners are fascinated by our parenting tales. It's just
Obviously.
how like 8 is the perfect age between like increasingly independent but still likes to snuggle.
Yeah, still good for a cuddle. Have you got a boy or a girl or
A boy.
Oh, what? Sorry.
A boy.
A boy. Oh, nice. I also have a boy. Yeah, he is. Yes, 8 is a very good age, and you're right. That balance is amazing, and the TV that he watches is so much better now as well. Like, I love Bluey a lot more than I probably should, but the stuff that he's watching is so much more interesting. And the games that he's able to play, we do a lot of Lego. I don't know if Lego is big in your house, but it is.
It comes and goes.
Oh God, it just never leaves my house. It is everywhere as well. So that is always a fun Saturday morning treat to step on Lego with bare feet. But yeah, but so I think that I have the kind of classic sort of parent thing built into me of like, but what about my kid? Like, he's going to see all this stuff, and I do dread to think what technology will look like by the time he's old enough to fully engage with it. But I don't know, but we will come to the future of it, and you can reassure me and all of our listeners who are now hanging on for not only our insight on tech but also our parenting tips to figure out how to approach that. But yeah, I think, to vaguely try and get back to the point that I was making, I think I think you're absolutely right. I think the nuance is really important, and I think that seamlessly, as though you knew what my next question was going to be, takes us into sort of the question around tech and ethics, and we'll kind of go particularly into AI in a moment, because I think that does hark back to the stuff that you're saying about, like, as an adult being able to hold like two ideas simultaneously. So in the last podcast you referenced, I think it was Kranzberg's first law, I've got that written down, about tech and neutrality. So, that tech is neither good nor bad, but nor is it neutral. And I think we have to hold the fact that the two ideas simultaneously is that there is, tech, it can be used for good and it can be used for bad, and it can be whatever you want it to be. And we actually talk quite a lot about, or used to talk quite a lot about, how tech is agnostic. And I got pulled up very politely, but on my last podcast with Elizabeth Shaughnessy, who works at Oxfam, and she is part of a group for NetHope that is working on a code of conduct for AI and human rights organizations. So if you guys don't know each other, you would have absolutely incredible conversations. But she was kind of saying, well, no, it's not. I politely disagree with your point that it is not neutral. And I wish I had known Kranzberg's quote then, because I could have said it back to her and sounded much more intelligent, but I didn't. But yeah, so I mean, AI, in terms of holding the two ideas in your head, like we have to know that tech can be used for anything, but also that it isn't neutral. It just isn't. And AI, I think maybe more than any other tech, has so much bias fed into it. So what is the main kind of concern? And I'm going to reiterate, we're going to come back to the positive, so this isn't just being a Debbie Downer on it. But what is the main concern around AI, or the main things to explore for Amnesty and for yourself personally?
There are four, I think, concerns, like real concerns, when it comes to AI. The first is around what we call algorithmic bias, and so artificial intelligence systems are trained on massive amounts of data, and that data is also often, scraped from the web, and really any data set that you can think of. It's not just that it doesn't reflect the best of humanity, but almost any data set that we collect reflects the biases of the institutions and organizations that have decided that that data is important and that collect it. And what that means is that the data that we use to train what are ostensibly neutral systems, that data reflects the racism and the misogyny and all of the inequities that we see in our cultures. And so one of the main concerns with artificial intelligence systems is that they are not, in fact, neutral arbiters, but that unless we pay very, very, very close attention, these systems, which we rely on for everything from creative pursuits to increasingly the ways that governments rely on these systems to determine who has access to benefits. Companies rely on these systems to decide who should get hired or as part of the hiring process, that these systems can exacerbate and amplify existing social inequities. And a simple example of this is, right when some of the 2 years ago, when Midjourney and DALL-E and some of the early generative AI image producing systems were released, if you said, show me a picture of a doctor, you'd get like 4 white dudes.
Yeah.
And that's not, the way that we want anyone, kids or anyone, to be like, oh, that's what a doctor looks like. So the first issue is, how do we make sure that these systems are unbiased? How do we address the biases that are built into these systems by their training data and other assumptions, and ensure that the outputs are as unbiased as possible? The second issue is around mis and disinformation. And I think that when we talk about mis and disinformation, it's I struggle with that. Because on the one hand, we can be like, it is wrong to, use these tools to generate content which is truly false, deliberately false. Like an example would be a video recording of a politician saying something that they never said.
Yeah.
And it's not that we have never had the capacity to do that before. It's just that what generative AI in particular means is much easier to produce deliberately misleading information and to do it at scale. Now, cracking down on that, how do you try and address that without undermining the right to freedom of expression? And satire is a really good example, right? Because if you say you can never use these systems to, poke fun at someone, or the line between like deliberate misinformation and then satire can often be blurry.
Yeah.
But what I think the mis and disinformation debate points to is not so much the question of how do we address like specific pieces of content generated by these systems, but the broader and I think more interesting question of how much can the information ecosystem that exists today, it is going to become increasingly difficult to understand who generated what kind of content and for what purpose, be it good or bad. And so I think that when we look to the future, we're looking to a future awash in propaganda of different kinds.
Mm.
And I think one of the problems is that when we do it, it's not propaganda. When the other side does it, it is propaganda. We're all, I think in some ways to varying degrees, the temptation applies to all of us. But there is a really good Hannah Arendt quote, which I'm going to get slightly wrong, which is when everyone lies to you, it's not that, people begin necessarily to believe the lies, it's just they don't begin to trust in anything.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, one of the implications of these technologies is we're moving towards I think, period of time in which it's going to be increasingly hard to trust what we read. So that's the second sort of implication.
Mm-hmm.
The third implication of these technologies is around surveillance. Because what these new generative AI technologies are particularly good at doing, it's not just generating content, but analyzing and summarizing massive amounts of content. And what that means is it becomes increasingly easy for governments or others to go through what in the past were unimaginably large corpuses of data, like social media content,
Mm-hmm.
And you don't need a human analyst now to try and summarize that. You can start to, in really problematic ways, rely on algorithmic systems to say, look at all this content and then alert me to what you, algorithmic system, think is problematic. And I think the UK equivalent is, you have CCTV everywhere across London. Imagine sort of CCTV, but that's not simply picking up, who's walking down the street, but is sort of omnipresent across all of your activities online. And then the fourth aspect of generative AI and AI systems, which I think is something that we need to be aware of and to address, is this question of our own personal autonomy. And this is the fuzziest of all of those. But we, I think, as these systems get more and more powerful, will rely on them as personal assistants. Help me write this email. Find all the information about X and summarize it for me. How should I respond to this? Like we will begin to we'll begin to treat them, these systems, as little assistants. And when we and as we bring these systems into our own, not just creative, but productive lifestyles, and careers, it is incredibly important that we understand the biases that these systems have.
Yeah.
Because otherwise that begins to compromise our own ability to think and act autonomously as we offload increasing responsibility to AI systems. So those are four of the things that we're, starting and trying to think through.
So just the sort of light, casual, kind of easygoing stuff then. Bloody hell.
I mean, I usually wait at parties before everyone's had a lot to drink before bringing this up.
I was going to say your dinner party your dinner party
Oh
chat
my God, you're saying I'm not a sparkling? You're saying this doesn't make you want to sit down and, eat a delicious dinner and hear about, the problematic future into which we might be entering?
It's definitely making me want to drink. So maybe wine.
I am sponsored by any number of alcoholic companies.
I'll bet. You must do well. Just anyone
it's a nice
not
business.
drinking, come talk to me about surveillance and mis and disinformation.
Yes.
Yeah, that was a lot. Absolutely fascinating. Your day to day must just be insanely interesting and quite intense, I would imagine. As a day job, that sounds like that must be quite a lot. So do you say that's all the stuff that your team specifically is working on, or is that Amnesty Tech as a bigger?
That's more of the stuff that I'm working on, just in terms of our emerging tech work, is starting to work on and just really starting to think through, like, again, when we think about the medium-term implications of this technology, what are these issues going to look like what are we going to be talking about in 3 to 5 years?
Yeah. Okay, good. Well, we'll have to get you back in 3 to 5 years and make sure that you can update us on that. And so, I mean, obviously, there's a lot in there. The mis and disinformation piece is really interesting, and that thing of going into an era that kind of nobody trusts anything is really fascinating. I think on a sort of human level of just not. I think we're kind of already there again. I don't want to keep coming back to social media, but I think, you know, a lot of people, hopefully, when they're looking at stuff, have got that kind of discerning eye of like, right, okay, well, is this real? But again, the quality, not just you mentioned that mis and disinformation, it's much easier now to generate imagery or videos or whatever. I think also the quality of it. So kind of looking at, we were looking at some bits, I think it was Midjourney, of the image generation and how much it's come on when you look at it from sort of within the space of a couple of years. It's just absolutely incredible. So the deep fakes and all that kind of stuff that can be created now, it looks believable. So it's not only easy to do and it's kind of anyone can do it. It's also pretty convincing, which is quite worrying. I was very fortunate to talk to Doug, whose surname I cannot remember, but who's head of data at Greenpeace in the US. And he was saying about that as well with data. It's just that thing of anyone can create a chart or anything now that sort of says, show a chart that, or create a chart that shows how Donald Trump actually won by a landslide in the last election or whatever. And you can kind of put that information out there and it looks credible. And that is definitely a big concern. The personal autonomy one that's gonna keep me up at night. I have not heard that one. Like the top three were kind of like, yes, I have heard this, I've read things about this. This is terrible. But the personal autonomy is a really interesting take that is quite upsetting.
Can I complicate that a little bit though?
Please do.
The flip side of this.
Okay.
Like, let's take mis and disinformation for a moment.
Yeah.
These are incredibly, I'd say, radically democratizing technologies.
Okay.
So one of the things that I think we forget about social media is that before social media, the entities that had the power to shape public conversation were incredibly limited and almost always controlled by elites.
Mm-hmm.
And what you see with social media is that anyone can broadcast. And it's the temptations to focus on the negative of that. And we certainly do. There's incredible power, right? Like every social change organization that I know has in some ways benefited from the fact that they can now, if their messaging is effective, reach people in ways they could never do it before. And you have different narratives that people can be made aware of that would never have happened in an era when there were 3 television news stations and 2 newspapers in your town. Now, some of those narratives we very much disagree with, but we use these technologies they're essential for us to put forward narratives that we think are incredibly important. And when we think about mis and disinformation, like it's Janus faced. So the negative face is, oh my God, look at all this horrific content. The other side of that is it continues this, I think, radically democratizing trend where all of a sudden smaller and smaller organizations have the power to create content that in the past only large entities were able to create. And that power can be used for negative, but it's also incredibly empowering. Like what we're entering, I think, more than anything else, is an era where there are fewer gatekeepers. Gatekeepers around not just the dissemination of content, but the creation of content. And that is neither good nor bad. Like that is, or more accurately, that is both good and bad. And again, when we talk about like the personal autonomy side of it, yes, one side of it is, oh my God, I have something I rely on. Can I trust it? The other side of it is, oh my God, this is like a superpower. And now I can create and do and produce so much more than I was ever able to do before. Me as an individual or my organization. And so I guess that's why when I said like keeping two different ideas in our head at once, you don't get the benefit without the drawback. And that doesn't mean we just throw up our hands and fatalistically be like, nah, c'est la vie, ooh, the future, scary, but also, it is like we fight, when there are ways in which, like, again, I think algorithmic bias is a great example where we're like, yes, there are steps that we can take to try and make sure that these systems are less biased. We should do that. That creates a world that we want. And so there's always room to fight to improve things. But there's no positive use case that you can't also twist into a negative use case and vice versa. And here's the last thing, then I'm going to shut up.
No, please
let's
don't.
Let's say I go back in time.
Okay.
124 years ago.
That's very specific.
And I tell you, there's this technology. It is going to destroy the environment and I know the statistics for the US, so we'll just use the US here, kill 50 to 30,000 people a year. Like, do you think we should develop this technology? And people be like, fuck no. I'm like, all right, well, let's get rid of the internal combustion engine.
Yeah. It's unintended consequences. You're very balanced, Michael. I'm clearly not an adult that is capable of holding two things in my mind, and I will be calling you.
I only turn it on for brief podcasts every 18 months, and then I go back to, perfectly biased.
You're going to start hearing from me when I'm spiraling about the state of apparently everything to do with future and the tech. Also, love the Janus faced. I'm going to use that in the future to make myself sound much more intelligent. But yeah, I mean, again, this is just a podcast of me telling you that you're saying excellent things. So I hope that you share this far and wide. But yeah, that is very true and very balanced. And I appreciate that. So 2 more bits, just because I appreciate I've kept you for a little while now. So obviously we've talked a bit about the horribleness and some of the balance, and we will come back to that balance as well. And you mentioned briefly about not briefly at all, you mentioned in very eloquent depth around the work that Amnesty is doing to kind of do the research and try and hold companies accountable. Can you talk a little bit more about sort of what you think, or what Amnesty is kind of pushing for the big companies to be held accountable? Because obviously there's not at the moment huge amounts of regulation. It is a little bit it's a bit of a Wild West landscape, and there's not really, like I said, I spoke to someone from Oxfam last week who was part of this Net Hope group that's trying to come up with this code of conduct for humanitarian organizations and AI, but that is kind of a very specific intersection. In terms of the sort of bigger companies, what are you guys trying to encourage them to do to have a good code of conduct with AI?
Amnesty is built around international human rights law. And again, very biased. But I think it's the advantage of thinking about international human rights law instead of ethics is international human rights law is actually a body of law that is codified and clarified. Like, it means this, like, freedom of expression. This is what freedom of expression means. These are the exceptions to freedom of expression. Like, there is not only treaty law, but there's court, there's judicial opinions. Like, it is a thing. It is a solid thing. We could argue, be like, this is part of it's wrong, this needs to be updated, but it is like, you can be like, international human rights law says this. Then people can argue about, like, well, what about this edge case? But like, there's a core. Whereas fucking ethics, like, argue about ethics since, I don't know, how many thousands of years back, ethics is very much in the eye of the beholder. And so when we talk about like codes of ethics or ethical codes, that's a lot squishier. And so to answer your question, Amnesty, we try and make companies live up to their responsibilities under international human rights law, because according to the UN, the guiding principles in business and human rights, companies have a responsibility to respect human rights. And human rights are a thing, like a defined thing. And second, we do push for regulation. And I think that's really, really relevant, in particular when it comes to a lot of these emerging technologies. The EU AI Act is a great example.
Which
Because,
I'm obviously extremely familiar with. Love reading that one all the time. But just for those who perhaps aren't as familiar with it, can you just give us a brief?
That's not what you read to your 8-year-old?
Not every week,
Not every week.
We're on Socrates and that kind of stuff at this point.
Mm-hmm.
The ethics, the old ethics, bit of Aristotle and that kind of thing.
The EU AI Act is a recent regulation passed by the EU to try and regulate both how companies and governments develop and use artificial intelligence systems. And I think that the pushback against regulation, the criticism of regulation tends to be like regulation never happens, or regulation gets it wrong, or
stifles innovation.
Stifles innovation. Do you want the government telling companies what to do?
Gross.
And my answer to those in order is, regulation does happen sometimes. EU AI Act, we're going to see regulation in California. So it's not as though there's never regulation. Like, this is a thing. It's a train that's coming down the track. Second, so what? Regulation isn't perfect. It's not like the status quo is perfect. You know what? And the nice thing is we can update regulation.
Imagine.
It's not like it needs to be perfect right at the beginning. And you know what? Most areas of our economy are regulated, and we have plenty of innovation. It's not that, innovation, just any innovation stifles it's not that any regulation stifles innovation. You can have regulation that is more or less friendly to innovation, but that we can discuss within the context of what the regulation it says. It's not an argument for no regulation.
For sure.
And finally, and most importantly, like, who the fuck do you want deciding what the world you look like lives in? Like, regulation, as flawed as it is the way in which we as citizens have a say in what the world we want to live in looks like, as opposed to just being like, well, just gonna be what it is.
It'll be what it'll be.
Yeah, it'll be what it'll be. Just make your decisions. I have no. And so, I think that the devil's greatest trick was convincing people that regulation was not a useful thing to focus on. Like, it's slow and it's messy, but so is everything else in life. So we focus a lot on trying to push for effective regulation. And that's a long fight, but like every fight worth fighting is a long fight.
For sure. You've got to use the time somehow. So that is a very noble cause. But that's great. That's really helpful to know. The regulation piece is great. And I completely agree with you. It's much better than just being like, well, if we can't agree on perfect regulation, we should just have none of it.
Yeah.
That is not a good place to be, for sure. Okay. And then we're going to end on a positive note, because I feel like if people weren't drinking at the beginning of this podcast, they might be now. So, and every time you've tried to steer it positive, I've really course corrected us back to the negative. So I'm gonna ask you to give us some examples of where you think AI can be used for good in our sector.
I think that there are two ways that AI is going to be really powerful in our sector. The first is, I think it's going to give smaller organizations capabilities and capacities that in the past only larger organizations had. And you mentioned earlier, people can create a chart showing that Donald Trump won the election. That's the bad example. The good example is, like, now a small community-based group of 3 people can actually start producing, reports of the length and quality. And by quality, I mean, like, oh my God, these are nice looking charts and all this other stuff that in the past only an organization of 50 or 100 people could do. And so again, I think there's this democratizing aspect of it. So I think it's going to mean that you can get more done with fewer people, which is not, we're going to lay off people, but it means that smaller organizations, more resource strapped organizations are going to be able to do a lot more. When it comes to our sector and larger organizations, I think it opens up really fascinating opportunities to move and respond faster. We think of research, for instance, or we think of report writing, or we think of advocacy campaigns as things that take months and months and months to produce.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason those things take months and months and months to produce is, first of all, often the actual work itself, like the research aspect, takes months, and the writing takes months and months. And second is our own internal processes that govern that.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of these technologies are going to have an impact on the former, and the amount of time it takes to do something is going to become a lot less. Now, maybe our internal processes will evolve, or maybe they won't, but it holds out the opportunity that we can respond to events more quickly, and the more quickly we respond, the more relevant we are.
Amazing. Well, that is very positive, and I'm very glad that I asked that question, because that definitely makes me feel better about everything, and hopefully is inspiring for anyone that's listening. I think that first point about the small organizations being able to have that bigger capacity is really great, and it's a good one to remember, because like you say, it's not about making layoffs. It's like, we can get all of this done and we only need 2 people where we currently have 100. It's like you say, it's about, a group of 3 being able to do something that perhaps they weren't able to do, and presumably that will kind of level the playing fields in things like people applying for funding. So if they're trying to get a project off the ground and they want to apply for funding, and they can put together a funding bid that looks super slick and professional, like, that's gonna help. And I'm sure there are much sexier, more impactful examples, but a good looking chart was the first thing that came to my mind. So there you go. But yeah, that is wonderful. Thank you so much. That was incredibly interesting to hear your take on all of that. And yeah, that was very insightful, and you were extremely eloquent. So I really enjoyed talking to you about all of that. So thank you very much.